This is the magnet. It always has been. This is the melting pot. This is where you can go. You get exploited along the way to get here. There's obviously something about this country that has served as a magnet for people for all over the world. If not for themselves, at least for their children, right? To set up a foundation for posterity. And I don't know why you would be surprised that also hasn't included Latin America. But who you are, where you come from, how you look, plays a role in how receptive people here are to you.
You're listening to The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place. My name is Mike Rush, and today we're tracing one of the most significant and often untold stories in the formation of modern Northwest Arkansas, the history of Latino immigration, and the powerful forces, economic, political, and cultural, that shaped it. My guest today is Dr. Steven Rosales, Associate Professor of History and the Director of the Latin American and Latino Studies Program at the University of Arkansas. His work is focused on Latino labor, migration, and identity in the U.S. Southwest and beyond, and he brings that lens to help us understand what happened here in Arkansas and in this region. This episode invites us to consider what was it about the United States, and specifically the U.S. South, and even more specifically Arkansas, that drew so many Latino families in search of stability, safety, and a better future. What made this region attractive not only to those seeking work, but also to the companies that needed a steady, low-cost labor force to power their growth. As we heard in the last episode, the Ozarks underwent another seismic transformation in the late 20th century, shifting from agrarian independence to corporate consolidation. But economic transformation doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires people. And for the poultry industry and construction and food processing and other essential industries across Northwest Arkansas, those people were and continue to be mostly Latino immigrants. Today's conversation with Dr. Rosales is about that movement. But it's also about what followed: the creation of communities, the rising of families, the founding of churches and small businesses. It's about how these communities took root, often with little structural support, and how they redefined what Northwest Arkansas is and what it might become. And it's about reckoning with the reality that we cannot tell the story of this region without the story of our Latino neighbors. To do so would be to neglect the very people whose labor, culture, and presence have built so much of what Northwest Arkansas is today. All right, we got a lot to work through. Let's get into it. Well, I have the privilege today of sharing a table with Dr. Steven Rosales, who is an associate professor in the Department of History here at the University of Arkansas, and also the program director of Latin American and Latino Studies here. And Dr. Rosales, thanks for sharing the table. Thanks for being here. Welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Mike. I feel privileged to be asked to be one of your episodes in your podcast.
The privilege is mine, and so thank you for being here today. Let's start. We can start wherever you want, but I'd love to start with who you are, your background, and maybe move us towards why this area of study has been important to you.
Geez, do you want the full spiel?
I'll take whatever you're willing to share.
February 1970, birth date and month, Los Angeles, California. Born into poverty. Born in East LA, Los Angeles, right? The eastern side, east side of LA. Mom is a Tejana from West Texas. That's where my family roots are. My grandmother, it's a border story. If you go back far enough, I think everybody's got a border story, unless you're Native American. But my grandmother was born in Los Angeles, 1918. Big old drive against Mexicans, a repatriation drive to kick out in the 30s during the Great Depression. About $500,000 to $1 million is the rough estimate. So my family actually got kicked out in the 30s. My grandmother had 6 children overall. The first 4 born in Mexico, Chihuahua, northern Mexico. And then the last 2, my mother, number 5, and my aunt, number 6, were born in Texas, El Paso. They were there through the late 40s, 50s, 60s. My grandmother came back. She was kicked out of the country in 1933. She came back in 1946, so she was gone for 13 years. And so when she came back, she had 4 kids, had 5 and 6, including my mother. And in the late 60s, they all started to head back to Los Angeles. So my mother had left El Paso for Los Angeles in 1967, and then I was born there February 1970. Inner city life. What do you want me to say? I'm not going to paint a rosy picture for you. I went to bed hungry pretty much almost every day. Saw my mother cry herself to sleep almost every day, asking, pleading, where the source, so she thinks I'm asleep, where the source of her next meal is going to come from, right? The Virgen de Guadalupe, the Virgin Mary, is kind of big for those of Mexican ancestry. So she had a particular affinity for praying to the Virgin Mary, Virgen de Guadalupe. I remember them now, sitting here talking to you. And so it came young to me, a kind of consciousness. I don't know how to describe it fully, completely. A kind of awakened consciousness. Why do I live this way? Why does my mother cry all the time? Why is every day such a grind? Because poverty's grinding. And so I knew I was going to do something with education. I just knew it. I just knew a bachelor's, whenever it happened, a BA and MA was not going to be enough. I just knew I was going to go on and get a PhD. I went into the Navy first. It's a way out, right? It's a way out, right? You get 3 hots in a cot, paydays first and the 15th. It was a way out. I was a little intimidated by the Marine Corps. Almost went Army. And the last second, I just chose the Navy because I didn't know anything about the water. So I did 4 years active duty right out of high school. Literally graduated on a Wednesday. Monday left for boot camp. I did Desert Shield. That was my first deployment, active duty, Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Left, was discharged in June of 92. So I did my 4 years. Stayed in the reserves that August. So another component to me, so as I went in my civilian life, is I left active duty and then started on my career in academia, because then I got my BA from UC San Diego, 1998, and I got my PhD from UC Irvine, so West Coast story, and I was stationed in San Diego. I got my PhD in 2006, 2006. And along the whole way, I stayed in the reserves. It was extra income. It was a weekend away or more, a couple of weeks in the summer. I traveled all throughout the Pacific, into the Persian Gulf, on 2, 3, 4 weeks of what we call annual training, AT. It was summer money. And then along the way, an opportunity for commissioning showed up. So those are my two halves. I'm Prof. Steve, as I tell my students to call me, and I'm also Sailor Steve. In 08, 09, an opportunity came up for a commissioning, to put in a commission packet, a packet to be commissioned as an officer. I took my oath as an officer August of 2010. And my first gig out of grad school was a liberal arts in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Grand Valley State. And then my wife at the time was at the University of Kansas, just north of here, and Arkansas was willing to hire us both, what we call a spousal accommodation. This is a Research One institution in the world of academia. It's at the upper rung, right? So that's what brought us both here in the fall semester 2013. She into the English department, where she still is, and then me into the history department, which is where I'm still at. My focus within my PhD is the U.S. West, in particular the modern U.S. West, so Mexican-American War, Gold Rush era, 1845, 1850, forward. Within that, because I can be construed, and 30 years ago I would have been construed as ethnic studies. Ethnic studies closes doors, narrows your opportunities, right? Basically, you're going to be coastal in this country if you have a PhD in that, if you're regarded as ethnic studies. The pulling of ethnic studies into the more academic mainstream has been a process. In other words, it's taken time. And so I went into the two front doors to get to my community. So I went into my PhDs in U.S. history, door one. And then my regionalization is U.S. West, the biggie, like the U.S. South, right? So that's door two. And then to give me credentials, to give me cred. And then from there, I went into the Chicano Southwest as a field of study. And why I'm driven, it's my contribution, my analysis, my critical analysis, whether or not that's well received. But I'm the poor kid who went to bed hungry every day and saw his mother cry herself to sleep almost every day. I knew I was going to get a PhD, and I knew it was going to be the study of my people. I just knew it. And it was only a matter of turning it into reality. And then on top of that, so my book is, so I don't want to be vain here, Soldados Rasos, Chicano Politics, Identity, and Masculinity in the U.S. Military from World War II to Vietnam. So I look at Mexican-American men from 1940 to 1975. And so even further than that, that other big community in my life, right, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. military overall, my field of study is what we call an additional field, like a 1A field of study is war and society, moving beyond just combat, because that's the overwhelming arc of military history, is just combat. There's nothing wrong with that. Yes, mainstream academics do tend to front on that. But moving beyond that and looking at the social aspects of warfare, including, not excluding combat, but also including other aspects to service, GI Bill, race, gender, et cetera, big biggies, right? Biggies. And I kind of brought all that together coming here, right? In academia, but also it came together while here. The field of study is my community, my two communities in my life, Mexican-American within the world of Latino, Mexican-American in particular, right? We're not all, we'll get to that, but we're not all the same. We tend to get lumped together, but we're not the Brady Bunch, the Brown Brady Bunch. That we are not. There's tensions there. There's solidarities. There's tensions too. And then the military, especially the U.S. Navy. And so my first book dealt with military service from World War II to Vietnam from 1940 to 1975. My next book project takes off where I left off, from 75 forward. But in that one, if I can continue, just give me a little bit more to still be vain. I would be remiss if I only focused on Mexican Americans. The community is just simply way too diverse now. It has diversified. All the old historical patterns are all gone, or at least changing. And so I have to look at all Latino groups. So South American, Central American, Mexican American, Puerto Rican, Caribbean, I have to. And women, right? I got a little bit of flack for not including, and we're in a time period, right? The latest data, 22% of all discharges are female. So I have to include Latinas, right? Just have to. I got a little bit of pushback with the first book. I'd get crucified. I would get crucified by my fellow academics, women in particular, sure. If all I did was exclusively, in my examination of the Latinos in the military now, if I only looked at men, I would get crucified. I've been doing oral histories, collecting oral histories. It's part of my research. Amazing stories by women. Amazing stories. But that is book project number 2. So it's a conflation of the personal is political, is often said. Not everyone accepts it. The I, the you, the individual, tends not to get looked at in academia, right? You're supposed to be the neutral observer, in theory, if you want to follow the rules to the profession. But was driven by my experiences in childhood to study my community and to study it in adulthood. And I am Mexican American. I am who I study, but I'm also a United States sailor. So it just came together. I hope I've done a decent job of explaining it. But the experiences from childhood through adulthood, I focus on Latinos, specifically Mexican Americans, and I focus on war and society and the Navy, but the military overall.
Dr. Rosales, I could see as you work through this conversation that, it's deeply personal to you, and this is your story. And I would argue with anybody who says this is not the quintessential American story. And so I think that's the purpose of our conversation today, is to frame this a little bit, to understand from your perspective, what does it mean to be Mexican American, to be a veteran, to live in the way and the story that you have in a way that furthers our understanding of what it means to be a citizen, to be an American, and to be a member of this community as well, too. And so I just want to say thank you for your service. Thank you for your story, for who you are. And I know this is deeply personal. And so.
Yes, that it is. Yes. It isn't just my job. It's my life. It can sometimes be rare where you bring the two together, right?
Yeah.
But I've had the pleasure of being able to do that, right? My job reflects my own personal stories, right? Service in the military, but also being a member of the Latino community, Mexican American in particular.
I can think of no better foundation from which to start this conversation. And so maybe within that context, maybe let's start, I'll defer to you on the framework that we want to set. But when we start to think about immigration to the United States and Latino immigration to the United States, can you maybe help give us a framework of how do we start to think about that within the studies that you've done, within your own life? Well, what's the framework we should be starting to think about?
I teach a course on U.S. immigration history. Of course, I include Latin America, right? I start off with Ellis Island, some of the other ports like New Orleans, right? And locally here, Town, that's where the Italian immigrants come through, is New Orleans. There are other ports of entry. I start off with European immigration. I think I'm deliberate in that regard. I do the slave trade, the Great Migration, and migration doesn't have to be external sourced. It can be internal within a country. So like Arkies and Okies going out to California, right? John Steinbeck, the Grapes of Wrath. African Americans leaving, going up to, although they're coming back. A lot of people are tag, as I say in my class on the history of Latinos in the U.S., with regards to the South, tag, you're it. Because they're coming here, brother. They've been coming here for a while. And they're going to, it's you haven't seen anything yet. I do immigration from Asia, and then I end with Latin America. And there's a vast sea of possibilities with regards to Latin America, including longevity. As I stress with students, there's a tendency to want to view Latinos within the prism of the last generation or two. You all just got here 20, 40, 50 years ago. Of course, that grouping is here, of course, and Arkansas has that. It's an immigrant community. But within that vast sea of possibilities is also 400 years, right? The old, what we call the old Texas borderlands. It's also been called New Mexico borderlands too, but mostly Texas borderlands. So it's the western half of Texas, New Mexico, eastern half of Arizona, up through the southern half of Colorado, up to Denver. That's old. Santa Fe, and right smack in the middle of that Texas borderlands is Santa Fe. Boom, 1598. To a lesser extent, Albuquerque and El Paso, because El Paso will emerge as the main entryway. It was really the only city in the inhospitable terrain, desert terrain. It was the only city that people could funnel through. Now folks, and for some time now, folks don't care. They'll cross it at any remote point. 100 years ago, they did. But right smack in the middle of that is Santa Fe, New Mexico, 1598, which is older than everything on the eastern seaboard. 1607, Jamestown, 1619, carefully stated, the 1619 Project, and everything up in New England, the Pilgrims, Massachusetts Bay Colony. It's the only thing older than Mexican-American history is indigenous history. Senator Lee out of Utah was the deciding vote on whether or not to have a museum dedicated to Latinos in D.C. He voted no. Part of his rationale was that we haven't been here long enough. Can I do that on the mic? I just want to go into his staff office and give him a history lesson, right? Because the Texas borderlands is older than everything on the eastern seaboard. So in this vast sea of possibilities for Latinos, based on nationality, based on race, based on gender and sexuality, right? There's all kinds of differences, right? There's also newness, right? There's also recent arrival. There's also 400 plus years that gets completely ignored. That old Texas borderlands, right, is older than we have a very east to west narrative in our mindset, right? East Coast, European settlers that marched from sea to shining sea, crossed the Appalachians, crossed the Mississippi, crossed the Great Plains, crossed the Rocky Mountains, and lo and behold, about 230, 40 years, you run into the Pacific. You got Lewis and Clark in there, you got the Santa Fe Trail, you got Buffalo, you got the railroad. New Mexico border, the Texas borderlands was there all along. And so in the case of not all Latino groups and not all Mexicans, those of Mexican ancestry, but in that vast sea of possibilities lies longevity, lies history. And I stress that a lot, right? So you have a little bit of everything. I don't know that you can focus on one thing. Just sheer numbers wise, you're probably going to focus on the recent stuff and recent immigrant communities like you have here in Arkansas. And and the South is it. And so Chattanooga apparently is a biggie now. So it's a modern day Rogers and Springdale. But to get back to your question, it's a cornucopia. It's a pot of all different kinds of possibilities. You have newness, you have immigrant communities, you have fleeing communism like Cuba, Cuba in 59, Nicaragua 79, and then Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, Maduro, et cetera, et cetera. South America is it now, right? You have the newest group that overtook Mexicans, you have Central America, especially what we call the Northern Triangle, so Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and of the three, El Salvador is the biggest source. But now in the last 5 to 10 years, it's South America now. It's changed, it's expanded to include South America. Yes, Venezuela and Colombia at the forefront. If you haven't noticed, Venezuela's getting a lot. And whatever that criminal group is, three something, I forget the name of the group. But Venezuela's getting a lot of attention. But in other words, it's hemispheric now. What was once very Mexican-centric included the Caribbean. I'm trying to visualize a map in front of me here. But of all Latinos here, roughly 60% are Mexican ancestry. But so very Mexican-centric, that then included the Caribbean, and then from the 80s forward is also expanded to include Central America and now South America. Very much a product of, even though folks don't want to hear it, but recent, I don't want to say globalist, but these trade agreements, like NAFTA, CAFTA, Central American Free Trade Agreement. I used to say SAFTA. I used to say, you're going to have a SAFTA, South American Free Trade Agreement. It's getting these trade agreements from the get-go were critiqued by the left, right? Fair trade versus free trade. But recently, in the last decade, sure, maybe a little bit more, it's also critiqued by the right. They're just getting critiqued, period. And so it's a range. I don't know that I can fixate on one or two things, but it's a vast sea of possibilities that includes length and history and also newness and all points in between from the entire hemisphere now. So what once might have been one or two sources is now the entire hemisphere. To my knowledge, excluding Brazil, although don't be surprised that Brazilians start to show up too. This is the magnet. It always has been. This is the melting pot. This is where you can go, as we were talking about earlier on a little bit, you get exploited along the way to get here. There's obviously something about this country that has served as a magnet for people for all over the world. If not for themselves, at least for their children, right? To set up a foundation for posterity. And it's included. Don't be surprised. I don't know why you would be surprised that also hasn't included Latin America. But who you are, where you come from, how you look, plays a role in how receptive people here are to you. Right? But every group, including Europeans, the Irish, the Know-Nothing Party, right? I teach all of that. Even the Irish, Catholicism, oh my. The first Catholic nominee for president was the governor of New York. Oh, I'm forgetting his name, 1928. Oh, I'm forgetting his name. But anyways, yeah, the anti-Catholicism even was horrid, right? Now you had just Biden, who's critiqued for other reasons, not so much as Catholicism, at least I don't think. But yeah, and Italians, or Southern European groups, Eastern European, Slavic groups, Irish, were critiqued. All sorts of Asian, oh Lord. The hostility, the nativism, right, fear of immigrants and what they represent. Directed the Yellow Peril with regards to immigration from Asia, Chinese Exclusion Act, Gentlemen's Agreement with Japan, the Cooper Act with the Philippines, the Reed-Johnson Act of 1924 slams the door shut. That is not Emma Lazarus. Give me your tired, your poor, your hundred masses, rather the opposite. Clearly something about immigration from Asia set off all sorts of alarm bells. And so you have to understand what I teach, what I pound into my students. The willingness to inclusivity, has to be seen in tandem with the capacity to exclude. That's U.S. immigration history, not one or the other, but both. And if you want to look at sheer size and frequency, the capacity to exclude is bigger and more powerful than the willingness to include. And it continues up. Immigration is a hot button, hot item issue. It was 100, 150. The Know Nothing Party is often considered to be the first nativist organization, specifically dedicated to Irish and Catholicism. It hasn't stopped. I think it's only grown. And I don't know, what am I allowed to say?
Say whatever you would like.
In our world of grievance politics, and the border does need some controlling. I'm not gonna dismiss that, yes. But in our world of grievance politics, it works, right? It works. In this theme of people who aren't supposed to be here, right? Like communists, terrorists, the undocumented are every bit as powerful and have been there throughout the whole time, right? And yet they perform jobs that we critically need, right? To declare your poultry workers critical workers during COVID says something, right? And they're at the bottom rung of the ladder of the system, get paid the least, but they make the system, they're the fuel to the engine that makes that engine, that economic system run. and produces profits. This core, what we call this corridor of prosperity here in Northwest Arkansas, which is Tyson, J.V. Hunt, Mattel is here, and of course Walmart, how could I forget, is built on, as many other, if not all, corporations, is built on cheap labor. That's the history of U.S. immigration. The face providing that cheap labor is differed, but of late it's been Latinos, yes.
I think one of the ways that you've laid out this kind of framework for immigration in the United States is incredibly comprehensive. It's incredibly wide. As we think about how that has emerged in the South or in Arkansas or in Northwest Arkansas, are there similarities to this? Is this the same story, or are there some unique factors at play when we get into the South or into places like Northwest Arkansas that may be more true or less true, or maybe don't follow that trend?
There's Texas, right? There's Texas. Probably my step one in trying to answer your question is Texas. And Texas is southern. As I always like to describe Texas is bi-regional. It's southern in its identity, right? It's a slave state. It's part of the Confederacy. It's a Jim Crow state. But it's also southwestern, the Alamo, right? And Donnas, right? My elders, they're all, and Texans are loud. Get my family, get my aunts and uncles, my mother, they're loud, right? White, brown, African-American Texans, Texans are loud, like New Yorkers, they're loud. Texas has a lengthy history with regards to, more specifically, Mexican Americans. Obviously, they're part of that Texas borderland, as I was talking about earlier. So I would steer your question to geographically to the region, and then Florida has its own history too. So I would steer your question geographically to the area between Texas and Florida, that part of the South, because the bookends, if you will, have a lengthy history of Latinos in them. Texas maybe a little bit more so than Florida. It's the South in the middle that historically just hasn't had it. There's been braceros here. The Bracero Program was a World War II measure in 1942, meant to only last for the duration of the war, providing cheap. Mexico is part of the Allies. The Allies are 44 altogether. Mexico has combat troops in Europe, has a squadron or two in the Pacific, but arguably Mexico's largest contribution are all these single men. It's a binational guest worker program. There's a lengthy history of guest worker programs in the history of this country. And so but the Bracero Program is the biggest in terms of size, 5.4 million, and in terms of duration, only meant to last there's two versions, one dealing with the railroad industry, the other dealing with agriculture, agribusiness. The one dealing with the railroad version ends in February of 46, so it ends right soon after the war ends. The other one was just simply so popular, as I often tell my students, right, it's like the heavens open and down fell all these Mexican dudes, because it's sanctioned by not one government, but by two, Mexico City and D.C. 6-month contracts are renewable for a second 6 months for 1 year max in theory. Undoubtedly, could you serve longer than that and just break the rules in the process? Sure. But it's from 42 and it lasts for another 19 years until December 31st, 1964. That guest worker program brought about $250,000 to Arkansas, the first big batch, about 50,000 in 1949. Continued through the 50s. As it continued, 2/3 of that 5.4 million are from 1954 to the end, 64. There's 3 stages to the Bracero program. The war years, 1945 to 54, and then 54 to 64. So the 2/3 of that is 1954 to 64. Just in the case of Arkansas, it actually does the opposite. It decreases. The first 2 big batches were 1949, 1950, altogether about $250,000, but the program actually decreases. Why? I can't tell you that. I don't know that I have that answer as to why, even though the program increases, the presence in Arkansas decreases. Does Jim Crow probably have a role to play on that? Sure. Because to offer like a scenario or two in the case of Texas, some of the stories of brutality in Jim Crow Texas were pretty brutal. Reports got back to Mexico City, and so they actually banned braceros from Texas 1943 to 1947. It was a guest worker program that overwhelmingly, as the relationship between Mexico and the U.S. is a fraught one, love and hate. But D.C. has all the power, or at least the majority of it, not Mexico City, not Mexico. But in that one instance, Mexico had enough leverage to ban braceros from Texas for 4 years and then remove that restriction, and they went back to Texas. Undoubtedly, stories would have circulated amongst braceros, probably filtered their way back to Mexico and Mexico City, to the powers that be in Mexico that might have told similar-minded stories of lack of tolerance. Can I say it that way? In Arkansas and other parts of Arkansas not considered the Deep South, but they were all over the South. The first major imprint of Latinos, in this case Mexicans, Mexican nationals, is the Bracero Program. There might have been smaller numbers for whatever reason prior to that. There was but once again, there's an immigrant community, especially political exiles from various regimes in Mexico, Cuba, other parts of Central and South America. There might have been in Florida and Texas. But the South, between the two bookends, Florida and Texas, the presence is small. The first bigger footprint is the Bracero Program. And then chicken. What do you want me to say?
Maybe before you get to that, and tell me to shut up if you want to keep talking about it. Let me ask real quick if I can. When we look at this program, especially into the states within the bookends, I like the way that you've laid that out. They're entering into a southern place that is Jim Crow, highly racialized society, segregated society. How does predominantly Mexican immigrants what does that look like when you enter into a space like this? What kind of table does that set or not set for what that looks like from their role within society in that space?
It's complicated, right? It's complex because you're into a pre-existing racial binary, black and white. But do keep in mind what we call Juan Crow, a pun off of Jim Crow. You're Hispanicizing it. Jim, Juan, sure. Not quite the most literal translation, but anyways, institutionalized on the... it's complicated. But yeah, I'll go there. It formalized, institutionalized discrimination on the part of Jim Crow, codified into law, as Jim Crow was. State law, not federal, with some federal pushes like Plessy versus Ferguson, 1898, with some recognition on the part of the federal government with regards to codified state Jim Crow laws. That did not happen in the Southwest. Yet you still had racialized violence in the Southwest. Yet you still had structural inequality in the Southwest. So the Southwest, the Mexican-American, the Chicana, South Mexican-American community of the Southwest was not free of many of the same, if not most of the same characteristics you could find in the Jim Crow South vis-a-vis black bodies. Just not formally codified into law as it was in the South. Did that make a difference? Does that make a difference? That lack of codification? It can to some. But entering into a pre-existing system of inequality would not have been new, per se, necessarily. However, in the South, yes, you have a third group, right? You have white Southerners, you have this newly arrived Mexican group. And for a while there, you have three different groups at play. I'm not trying to give you too much of a history lesson here.
Oh, but please.
During the duration of the Bracero program, you have three agents involved, three groups. You have Mexican Americans, somebody like me, born here and therefore legal. You got the undocumented, illegal. Then you got braceros, also legal for the duration of their contract because they're guest workers. So you got, within the Mexican American community, you got three groups at play there for about 22 years. Now you bring these Mexican nationals into the South. Yeah, you're confronting not just white Southerners and Jim Crow. You're confronting African Americans too. So there's an interplay there. More often than not, universally, any community will have its subgroups, and each layering will have complexities and difficulties associated with them, how each of the subgroups interact. And so, yeah, you're having to navigate white Southern society. You're also having to navigate in black Southern society. And I can't tell you what a bracero might have felt specifically. I can't pinpoint the exact sentiments that a bracero upon arrival, or any of the three groups, maybe they were Mexican Americans, probably smaller in numbers. Maybe they were undocumented, probably in smaller numbers. Now it's bigger, of course, but we're talking 80 years ago. Certainly Mexican braceros were there. So any of those three groups that might have been between the bookends, I can't pinpoint for you their exact feelings and sentiments. But it's a process of constant negotiation. and having to navigate the immediate environment and situation at hand as you try to earn a living, right? As you try to make a livelihood and do what you will with that money, send it back to Mexico, whatever the case might have been. In case of these guest workers, they got paid, if I remember correctly, once a month. And there are stories on payday. Paydays can be a time for a lot of these young men that, to the chagrin of local groups, law enforcement, community elders, religious elders, paydays can be renowned for their debauchery. You go let loose. That's for any group of men. There's a story or two, yes, of paydays, Mexican men just tearing up the town, getting liquored up and doing what they will, trying to visit local brothels. Yeah. Whatever pre-existing stereotypes might have existed or animosities might have existed, behavior such as that only reinforces it. And so it only makes your situation and those still following behind you all that much more worse. I don't know if that process, that gaze, because it's a gaze, it's a racialized gaze, I don't know if that gaze has completely gone away either, no. And then it extends outward from there. All Latinos behave this way. All Latino men behave this way. All Latinos behave this way. And once again, the Latino is a myth, right? We're diversified in all sorts of different ways. And 80 years ago, there might be an increased willingness to start to recognize, for example, there's distinctions being made now between Central America and Mexican. There is. Even Caribbean. And now you got to throw South Americans in the mix. 80 years ago, probably not. There would have been a blanket assumptions made, right? We tended to, for the longest time, and I used to teach it a lot in my class, we tend to want to have a Mexican gaze to all of Latin America. They're all Mexican. It's diversified a lot in the last 20, 30 years. 80 years ago, no. We would have had Mexico Mexico would have been on the brain 80 years ago.
Let's go back to your comment, chicken. Maybe that is the one word that is the description of what started to draw Latino immigrants to Northwest Arkansas specifically. You've got pretty big changes in agriculture. Northwest Arkansas starts to emerge within this poultry industry. The need for low-cost labor still exists. Can you help paint a picture for what that does to the story of immigration, maybe to Northwest Arkansas specifically?
1990s, maybe late 80s, but certainly by the 90s, chicken nuggets, chicken wings, chicken thighs, during and immediately out of World War II, rationing going on during the war, continues a little bit after, with certain key items. Red meat would have been part of that. World War II is a big push toward poultry, cheaper, smaller animal, smaller carcass, less expensive than the meat processing of like the swine world, the beef world, etc. And then meat processing also, the two big centers historically were Chicago. If you're familiar with Up in Sinclair and the Jungle 1902, for example, it gives that inside look. The journalist that goes undercover and gives a sort of an inside look. Something was done similar here. If you want me to go that route too, I can.
You can go whatever.
The two big centers were Chicago and Cincinnati. So it's a confluence of different factors, right? And meat processing starts to get decentralized out of mega centers. Chicago, Cincinnati starts to go to the source, the animal, right? And you're going to have vast open spaces for chickens and cows and swine in the South. South's big geographically. So companies start to go to the South. And then in the pursuit of the bottom line, not to paint it as evil per se, but any corporation is built on capitalism as a system that's profit-driven. The essence of it, by the 90s, it begins as a trickle in the 80s, but definitely in full swing by the 90s up to the last 30 years, 35-ish, give or take. That continues into the 21st century up until now. First Mexicans, but then over time, other Latino groups. It's also hemispheric, whether it's Tyson or Pilgrims or what are some of the other ones? The Georges in pockets, and Northwest Arkansas is one of them. And so Springdale, initially, right? What do you want me to say? And doing it round the clock, as I describe capitalism to my modern day capitalism, the pursuit of profit is as old as us, as humanity, where it becomes systemic and global and round the clock, right? You can mass produce at 2 p.m. or 2 a.m., tables, chairs, cars. You can also mass assemble something. You can also mass disassemble at 2 p.m. or 2 a.m. So you can mass assemble tables, chairs, cars. You can rip apart a carcass of a chicken, right, where you disassemble it into its constituent parts any time of the day. Word spread, as word always does. Humans are creative. I'm not trying to be simplistic, but it spread to Mexico, and then from there it spread out throughout the rest of Latin America. Mexicans first start to arrive by the 90s and producing what you have now. So to the point now, the original pockets have pockets. Springdale's old news now. I don't know if you Southern folk understand that. Springdale's old news. It isn't the most recent. It's Clarksville. Having driven to Millington, I got to know the state a little bit off the 40. One of my reserve centers used to be Millington, so I used to drive across Arkansas. It's Clarksville, Lake Dardanelle, DeQueen, Cossatot, Lafayette, which is apparently on the Louisiana border, Monet, which is apparently over by Jonesboro. I have a young Mexican-American student from the Jonesboro area. Starts with an M, sorry. Yeah, that's the cutting edge. Actually, Rogers and Springdale are actually old news now. It's all the others. It's all the other places in Arkansas. I get a lot of Latino students. They're the children of immigrants. Their parents came here to pluck chicken. It doesn't pay the most, but there's plenty of work of it, and through sheer volume, overtime, and the traditional sources of geographic settlement, like the Northeast, Florida, the West Coast, the Southwest, West Coast, those are all gone now. That continues, don't get me wrong, but it's expanded to include the South. And then once you settle and start a life and get to know the area, maybe you want more or better choices, you expand from there into construction, into gardening, some of the landscaping, into domestic work. Look at the bus stops. I've always told my students, look at the bus stops, 5 a.m., 6 p.m. at night, 5, 6 a.m., busing up to Bentonville probably. 5, 6 at night, busing back down to Springdale or in any geographic setting. Look at the bus stops. That's where your domestics are at. And so from there, poultry might be the initial magnet. From there, you spread out, as people will do. People are creative, whether they're from Latin America or any other part of the world. People are trying to make a living. And so chicken is the first big pull, and just over time, you spread out and into other sources of employment. And maybe stay with chicken for a while, or reduce your commitment there, or maybe even leave it altogether, right? Because it's grinding work. Ask me, Mr. Mike, how many emails I've received from students who've lost or have family relatives who have lost fingers or limbs or have been damaged by working at Tyson and working at poultry factories. Ask me how many.
I probably don't want to know the reality of that.
37. 37 emails. Professor, prof for short, in Spanish, profe. My father, my mother, my sister, my brother, my uncle, my aunt, me, lost a finger or two, lost part of a head, lost a hand, lost part of an arm, lost a whole arm. And something in Dallas, there's medical facilities in Dallas, because all 37 got sent to the Dallas area. So obviously the aftermath of that physical injury, the medical facilities are there in Dallas, apparently, or contracted, whatever the case might be. But 37, I've gotten 37 notifications since I've been here in August of 2013. So something like that is also personal for me still, also because I'm a member of the community. It's a different community now. I'm not Southern. I'm Los Angelian, Southern California. I'm a Latino. I'm not a Southern Latino. I'm a Latino in the South, but I'm not a Southern Latino. But I am getting the children as students of immigrant parents, and their stories can be heartbreaking, sure. And it matters to me. And so it's part of the rationale for taking on program directorship. But I had to do this. I had my own stories that I gave you personally as a Latino, but also as in the military, in the Navy, but also within academia. And arguably, given where I'm at also in the South, I'm going to be as careful as I could possibly be. It's still coming out of the shadow and the legacy of Jim Crow. It's changed a lot. And more changes still need to occur. It's not done yet. And if you feel like everything's been accomplished, you would be remiss and thinking that. And that pre-existing, to bring it back to an earlier point, that pre-existing black-white binary is changing. And I'm not going to stand by and be quiet. I'm not. So whether it's in my work or a program director on a podcast such as this, I will advocate and I will speak truth to power. I'm not afraid of doing that. I fought way too many battles already in childhood, in the Navy, to not sit idly by. I refuse. And so the stories like the number that I gave you, 37, is only further fuel to the fire.
Today here in Northwest Arkansas, how should we be thinking about what it looks like to build a community where everyone feels like they belong, given the history?
Oh, I don't know if I can answer that one. That's a big existential question. I would preach tolerance, right? That's what I say to all my students, tolerance. Change isn't always well received, but I don't know if that's where you want to go with this podcast, per se.
I think at the root of it is this question of belonging, meaning that the story of immigration to the United States is not a new story. The story of Mexican-American, I would say, if you want to even call it immigration, is older than this country, as you point out itself. We have a new wave of immigration that's been building over the past decades from different places around the world, as you said, South America, Central and South America. As these immigrants come for jobs, there's a need for low-wage labor, but there's economic conditions in Central and South America, and even in Mexico today, that are driving the need for that. And so as we look at what is happening in Northwest Arkansas, there are these themes of immigration that seem to have existed since the beginning of this country, seem to still persist today. And yet we as a country seem to still be struggling with what it means to welcome someone new to this community, how someone new to this community finds their rooting, finds their belonging. And yet within the South, we still have a lot of historical wounds that have not fully healed around what racism looks like, that seems to always point at the newest arrival or at the immigrant. And I think the question rooted in that is, can we get past that? What are the barriers that we have? What's our own blind spots that are preventing or creating the situation that we're in today, where the immigrant has been and continues to be labeled as the other?
I talked about it a little bit, right? The theme of exclusion is every bit as prominent, if not more so, than the theme of inclusion. The theme of immigration overall is what we call chain. Migration has been typified by chain migration. It's been continuous, hasn't stopped. Just the source of the immigrant has changed. But the theme itself is consistent and is as old as the country itself, even prior to the colonial era. So immigration hasn't stopped, ever. There might have been lower eras, low points. It's been an ebb and flow, sure. Some eras massively bigger. 1880, 1930, for example, big one, from all over the world. All kinds of mass movement. 1880, 1930, you have the Great Migration out of the South. You have Ellis Island. You have the Great Migration out of Mexico. So 1880 and 1930 is one of the bigger ones, maybe the biggest one in terms of numbers and sheer size. From about the 70s onward, over the course of the 20th century, the type of immigrant increasingly became Latin American based. Of course, the source of origin became more increasingly brown. From about with deindustrialization in the 70s, as outsourcing begins to occur and the Rust Belt starts to shrink and jobs start to go overseas, Vietnam, Bangladesh, China. The world's engine to capitalism is China, right? For the last 40-ish years, give or take. So as deindustrialization starts to occur, yes, it's given a big push from Latin America and diversified beyond Mexico, as I was talking earlier, right? So the longest time it's Mexican-based, Mexican-centric. We had a very Mexican view to all of Latin America. They're all Mexicans. For a while there, sure, just not anymore, right? Not anymore at all. And then you got to add in globalization. I don't know if I said that specific word earlier. These trade agreements, which were in vogue from the 90s forward, critiqued from the left immediately, now also increasingly critiqued by the right. They're just critique, period. Part of the rationale for their creation was that the trickle-down theory, that the benefits of these bigger blocks, these behemoths, would trickle down, and everyone would get their fair share, not an equal share, but their fair share of the pie. And that in the process, it would minimize, not eliminate, but minimize the flow of the undocumented. Gross miscalculation. Totally got it wrong. I don't know how else to describe it, just 100% wrong. These bigger blocks. So whether I could show you the visual of the Syrian boy drowned on the beach in North Africa, I can show you the picture of the father and daughter from El Salvador on the banks of the Rio Grande in Texas. I can show you the picture of the Indian family in Manitoba, Canada, that froze to death. Yeah, gross miscalculation. And they're going to the EU. They're increasingly going from Middle East, Africa to the European Union. And it's hemispheric now. Right? Expanded well beyond it. Mexico's no longer, hasn't been for a good 20 years, if not more. Central America, especially that Northern Triangle I was talking about earlier, but now Caribbean to a lesser extent. Remember, Puerto Ricans are citizens. Jones Act. If you're born in the U.S., 14th Amendment, unless that gets reanalyzed. But 14th Amendment doesn't matter the status of the mother, so long as they're born in the continental U.S., and I believe the Commonwealth, don't quote me on that, the 5 in the Commonwealth, Guam, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, U.S. Virgin Islands, and I forget the 5th one. But if you're born in the 50 U.S. states, by virtue of that birthright citizenship, right? That child is born into his or her citizenship. The status of the mother is irrelevant. But the Jones Act, 1917, if you're born in, doesn't matter, if you're Puerto Rican, if you're born in the U.S. or you're born in Puerto Rico, you're a citizen.
What is the future of immigration to the United States or to Northwest Arkansas look like? What should we expect?
It's cheaper. There's plenty of land. It's cheaper than Texas, cheaper than the West Coast. California's expensive. Although pricing is getting like a Rogers and a Springdale or Benton County, Washington County, are also a little bit more expensive, right? Housing prices, and there's rush hour, there's traffic now. One of the top 10 spots, I believe, is Northwest Arkansas in terms of people of growth. And so you got even further out. You go to the Queens and the Clarksvilles and the Lake Dardanelles, right? And they're coming. They've been coming for about 30 years.
Maybe explain a little bit. I heard you talk when I went to the symposium earlier this year, the influence of where people are coming from within Central and South America, and what that influence really does start to do to the United States politically.
Sure. The tendency is to assume that all these others, all these immigrants, all these illegals are going to go to the Democratic Party. Gross miscalculation. Oh, my. Gross. And if you are fleeing communist countries like a Cuba, like in Nicaragua, Cuba 59, Nicaragua 79, and then Venezuela the last 20 years, right? That they're going to automatically run and be fully embraced by the Democratic Party. No, that's a gross miscalculation, right? If they're fleeing communism, the data's overwhelming. That lens, that experience from dictatorial regimes very much impacts their political worldview and how they view things, including here in the U.S. And don't paint them. There's also an assumption. There's also an assumption that all Latinos want an open border. Oh, my, no. All right? No. U.S. Border Patrol, 61% Latino. Everybody, U.S. Border, let me say that one more time. U.S. Border Patrol, the rank and file of the U.S. Border Patrol is 61% Latino. Brown bodies patrolling the border against other brown bodies. Complexity here. Don't be black and white in how you view things. There's complexities and complications all over the place. And yeah, where you flee from in Latin America can influence how you enter into the U.S. political system. Do not assume an automatic affiliation with the Democratic Party. No, do not. There is a connection, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller, but there's a connection to the GOP and to the current MAGA crowd as well, too, including immigration issues and the whole border itself. And it doesn't have to be just recent immigrants. My community, multi-generational Mexican-American community, the one big county, Stark County down in South Texas, went Republican for the first time since Reconstruction. And that's Mexican-American vote. My aunt, a personal story, my aunt and uncle in El Paso. There's still, the old family house is still in East El Paso, I believe. And it's there. The old house is still there. That one aunt and her husband, my uncle, still stayed there. So they got an immediate personal view of who's arriving in from what other part of Latin America. They're all critical of Central Americans. Do not like Central America. These are multi-generational Mexican Americans who have been, they could even critique Mexicans growing up when I was a child. But massively critical of Central Americans, massively critical of South Americans, especially Venezuelans. Do not assume solidarity amongst Latino groups. Do not assume that we're all one big happy family, the Brady Bunch. We are not. There can be solidarities facilitated by the Spanish language. Let's admit it, right? No other part of the world has that attribute, language. But don't take it for granted either. Don't overestimate that either. There can be downright hostilities as well, too, and disagreements and tensions. Maybe the one that maybe here, because the communities are bigger, that gets more attention is Central American, Mexican/Mexican American. There's tension there. There is. But it extends outward to other sources as well, too. And from what I understand and what I've heard and what I've read in the case of the Caribbean, for example, tension toward Puerto Ricans by Dominicans and Cubans. And so don't take it for granted that we all get along and that we're all marching to the same drum beat, right? And all have the same goal in mind. That you would be remiss in thinking that. There's complexities and nuances, solidarities, differences, and some of those, politically speaking, given your question, will steer them toward the Republican Party. And let's not be naive also, too, there's a gender component. Yes, we've had 2 female candidates in the last decade, both Democratic Party, unless you reincarnate Margaret Thatcher. I don't know that you'll have one in the GOP anytime soon, or Margaret Thatcher-like. But yeah, there is a young black and brown, massive, no, but noticeable, that, yeah, it was, in my humble opinion, is there also misogyny involved in terms of steering votes away from the Democratic Party? I would be remiss if I didn't include that as well. And so I think that was also an additional push in our world of, right, that old D&I, diversity and inclusion, is now DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's for right or wrong, however you want to view it, that I leave to you, but there's a generation or two of young men that are angry. Whether or not they're right to be angry or not, we can discuss. That's a further debate and discussion, but they're angry and they're voting with that anger. And then we already have a pre-existing system of grievance politics anyways to begin with. And one big community, you would be wrong to think of universal malehood. There isn't. There's often talk about universal sisterhood by comparison. There isn't either, but that is talked about. There isn't. There's a kind of male bonding that you can find like in the military, but universal malehood, no. However, having said that, and there have been other eras, other moments in U.S. history too, but we're certainly in one now. There's a disaffected generation or two of young men that are angry and using that anger to fuel their vote away from the Democratic Party, who also happen to have 2 female candidates, and pushing it toward. Can I go there?
You get, yeah, 100% if you want.
An individual who at least openly tries to exude bravado, the Trump 1.0 and 2.0. That will also have its, I think I'm being neutral, careful here, that his bluster is its own appeal to a lot of these young men.
Right? Sure. I would say there's been a resurgence of what it means to be masculine in America.
Sure.
That is being put back in the center stage in many ways to re-examine that.
Yes, you are correct. And then other added components over transgender, bathrooms. I think all that in the middle of all of that is, yes, I think you phrased it pretty well. And then for a while they're inherently thinking of masculinity as toxic. I think a whole lot of feminists might be angry at me. I think I've been pretty neutral here. And some of my colleagues here, female colleagues, might be angry. But yes, there's a generation or two of disaffected, angry young men that are squarely a part of this debate over what it means to be a man and what masculinity is in this country, over this larger debate over gender and sexuality too.
When you say there's this form of immigration is not stopping, help maybe build that out a little bit more, maybe explain that a little bit more.
Sure.
What do you mean by Yeah, what does that mean?
What you see now is you ain't seen nothing yet. Tag, you're it. They're coming. Whether that sounds ominous to you, that I leave to you. But yeah, the South is clearly, it's part of the larger, what we call the Sun Belt anyways, right? And it isn't just a fixation on the South, right? The process, the motivation for coming to the U.S. hasn't stopped. You can certainly enforce border regulations more strictly. It is at a lower ebb now in the first 100 days of the Trump 2.0, yes. The message is clear, and it's being received, if that's what you want to hear. And so it's dipped considerably. But they're still coming, smaller numbers perhaps, but they're still coming. And the South is it, right? The South is a big hotspot for a while now. Historically, saying this carefully, the South is the place you left. Historically, African Americans, white Southerners, for the last 30-ish years, the South has been it. It's bigger, it's cheaper, there's land. You can buy a house on a working class salary that you just can't in a Southern California. You just can't. You can buy a decent house for $250,000. You have to go out to Death Valley to do that in California. Or so you move out to Arizona, Nevada, et cetera, or Texas. But this is it. Tag, you're it. In the South, over the last 30 years, the two big hotspots thus far, North Carolina and Georgia, especially Fulton County. Atlanta is exploding as well. Fulton County. The 6 counties, including Fulton County, that comprise the larger metropolitan of Atlanta. There are other pockets, and Northwest Arkansas is one of them. But those pockets, we're at the point where I mentioned where those pockets also have pockets. And so, and as these children of immigrants start to have their own families, the rough estimate, nationwide, 2060, 2070 timeframe, I can't give you the exact date, 1/3 of the country is Latino. You're not stopping that demographic change. You can try, and about 15 to 20%, slowly but steadily, the new emerging binary, if you want to call it that, a new binary is Latino AAPI, Asian American. All right, demographically, 2060, 2070, about half the country is either brown or Asian American. And that includes the South. And that's through external sources. And what I'm trying to get at, part of what I'm trying to get at is that internally, the community already here, right, of that 18.2%, it's also young. I'm an old fogey, right? That 18.2%, 75% of that 18.2%, 3/4 of that is 25 or younger. Oh my. So it isn't, you can build that wall, you can patrol the border with brown bodies included. You can stop the external flow, but the internal flow hasn't begun to explode yet, demographically speaking. When that starts, because it will, when that 25 or younger gets to be of adult age and starts to have their own families, if you have a problem with demographic change now, what do you want to hear when it's 2030, 2040, 2050, when they start having kids and they start having grandkids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Because internally already, the communities of such a number internally, and it is young, that there's an explosion already going to happen from internal sources. That's not including external ones. And to the tune of about roughly 2060, 2070, about 1/3 of the country is going to be brown, some type of brown. But once again, you can view that as a threat and ominous. Massive complexities within that community. That 1/3 of the country is all not going to be marching the same drumbeat. It's not. And there will be opportunities for employers, companies, communities, community elders, politicians, political parties. Increasingly, the Latino vote. There is no Latino vote, also a myth. But there's opportunities there for everyone to start to curry the favor of this exploding community, Asian Americans too. And how you go about doing that, if you want to go about doing that, I leave to that corporation, to that mayor, to that city council, to the political parties nationwide, et cetera, et cetera. But don't be surprised. The metaphor of a sleeping giant is being used to describe Latino community. So as the sleeping giant starts to awaken and start to stretch itself, it's going to want a seat at the table. And that means confronting both ends of that pre-existing binary. That means confronting white America. That means confronting African America too. And that's where it gets a little even more complicated. I don't have nice and neats for you. It's messy. And that's about the best way I can describe it. All right? There's a sea of possibilities, and there's therefore, by extension, there's a range, if not more, actually, there's a range of methodologies that you can employ to reach out to probably specific Latino groups. But don't assume that Cubans in Florida speak for Mexican Americans in LA or Texas. You cannot assume that. Don't assume that Dominicans or Puerto Ricans in New York speak for South Americans in Florida. Don't assume that, right? So I would ask that you be mindful. We tend to want to lump all Latinos together and have a very monolithic view of Latinos. I would ask that you actually start to peel the layers of that onion and look at the pre-existing hierarchies and tensions and solidarities, good and bad. And if you're going to want something from a Latino, their labor, their vote, then it would behoove you to start to pay attention to the nuances, because that's then how you will ingratiate yourself to that specific Latino group. And then realize that probably what you're doing with a group doesn't mean you're doing it for all the group, because what you're doing with one group, another group might not like it or might not affiliate with it. And so it's messy.
Yeah, it has the opportunity to be beautiful, though.
Sure. But folks don't want to do the work.
Yeah.
But then I would ask that you do some of that work to make yourself more aware of the plethora of nuances that are out there. But yes, it's a rainbow. Yes, it's not a monolith in any way, shape, or form. I would stress that.
Dr. Rosales, thank you. I'll end here with my two final questions. And the first question that I try to ask every guest is, what are your fears for this place within your work, within this community? Yeah, what are your fears?
Man, how honest can I be? I don't know if I should be.
I've asked everyone this, and I will say this, like, it is, some people answer that question out of their position, and some people answer that out of their humanity. And I would say that my hope would be you would answer that out of your humanity. You've been very transparent. This is your story and your work. And so your fears, I think in many ways, the way we were able to vocalize those, to normalize those, is something we all have to do if we want to move past them as well.
Oh, I hear you. I've certainly heard the question, of course. I'm traveling through. This isn't my final destination. I've just got too much California in me and just too much blue. California blue, especially in me, yes. So at some point in time, I'm going back. I'm being blatantly, brutally honest. While here, I want to try to leave the place a better place. Yeah, I don't know. I also want to be realistic, right? I have become, I'll be honest, I'm supposed to be. I've become a little jaded over my 10, 11 years here. It's been a challenge being here and being an academic at this institution, being in the South overall, being in Arkansas overall. In that world of DEI, whether you want to hear it or not, just California moves at a faster rate. And so in a place where it is slower or sometimes stagnates, this makes it frustrating. I would just ask for tolerance. As I told my student, I taught the history of Latinos this semester that had just ended. My final was on Tuesday, 2 days ago. I would ask for tolerance and informed opinions. And so I literally told my students 2 days ago, you can disagree. Your opinion is your opinion and no one else's. And I'm not trying to force, whether you believe it or not, I'm not trying to indoctrinate. I'm not trying to force. Just be tolerant. You can be against the arrival of immigrants. You can be humanitarian and Christian about it, yes. So be tolerant, but also whatever your final opinion is, have it be an informed one, right? Don't use misinformation or wrong information to inform the opinion that you arrive at. So hopefully a podcast such as this, a class such as mine, and other colleagues that teach, there's only so many of us that teach anything remotely Latinos. There's only a small cadre of us. It's not big. But it isn't just me. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention my colleagues as well, too, who are part of my program, Latin American Latino Studies. But just having to fight an uphill fight. I'm a fighter by nature in all sorts of different ways. I don't run from a fight, can handle myself in a fight. Been doing it since I've been little. So it's almost second nature, unfortunately. But you can get tired of fighting all the time, yeah. Fighting, quote unquote, not literally speaking, metaphorically speaking. Oh my, getting myself in trouble here. And yeah, to be here is to fight an uphill battle a lot, consistently, and it gets tiring. You actually can get exhausted. But in the end, I would ask for tolerance on your part, and I would ask for informed opinions. Make your opinion yours. Just acquire information that informs your opinion, proper information. And in the case of Latinos, a podcast or classes mine and my colleagues, a podcast such as this, pick up a book or two. Can I go there? Don't always get your information from Fox News. No, that would be remiss. Pick up a book or two. I would recommend Perla Guerrero. Perla, P-E-R-L-A, Guerrero, G-U-E-R-R-E-R-O, Nuevo South. It's about everything I just talked about. She encapsulated in her book. She's from northern Mexico, was in L.A. in her early teenage years, about 6 years, and then her uncle came out to Fort Smith, and her family, her mom and dad followed. And so she went to Central Arkansas in Conway for a BA, and then went back to USC LA for her PhD. Now she's a professor of American Studies in Maryland, University of Maryland. And so Nuevo South, she talks, where I get a lot of my, not exclusively, but where I get a lot of my information that I just gave to you, I took from her, because my more immediate focus is the Southwestern Chicano Southwest. But pick up a book such as that, and there are others, and read, inform yourself. Knowledge, it's never too late to acquire knowledge. Never. Knowledge is the never-ending gift. Whether it's formalized in an academic setting, or whether it's picking up a book and reading at Starbucks or at home, pick up something and read and inform yourself, and make it an informed opinion, not a misinformed one. Because misinformed ones lack tolerance and tend to want to hate. Or, yes.
I think you're moving towards this. I think my last question for you, that strings all of the question or the concept that we try to use to string all of these conversations together is this idea of wholeness. And so when I use that word and I ask you, what does wholeness look like in this space? You may have touched on this, but let me ask you overtly, what does wholeness mean to you in this space?
It isn't just religion. I'll be blunt and direct, right? Religion can be a connection. Historically very Catholic, right? A lot of these sources of immigration from Latin America, certainly Mexico, other parts of Latin America too. It can be a connection, just as long as it isn't the only connection, right? Because if you look at someone as a fellow Christian neighbor and treat them as such, only within a religious context, within a spiritual context, there's a whole material world that also needs dealing with too, right? And that is limiting, whether you want to hear it or not, it is. So religion should be a step, maybe even a bigger one, fine, within a whole series of steps that hopefully begins to accept and acknowledge, maybe begrudgingly, but begins to accept and acknowledge the changed reality of your local environment. There can be a theme, I've been run up against it more than a few times, of this is how we do things around here, and fear of outsiders. You got massive change on your doorstep for the last 30 years, and it's only going to continue. And how you respond to that change is on you. And I would hope that you just don't use a prism of religion and Christian fellowship to view and try to accept this massive change. But I hope you would use a broader gaze and view to the world. And it's global, right? It is, because it's a system in place. Immigration isn't just specific to the U.S. My Lord, there's immigrations all over the world. From my travels in the Persian Gulf, the Latinos of the Persian Gulf are Indonesians and Filipinos, especially women, right? They're the Latinos of the Persian Gulf, because Saudis, Bahrain, they don't do manual labor over there in Saudi Arabia, right? They rely on Filipinos and Indonesians to do that. So there's immigration to and from all over the world. Think big, think bigger. Just don't think local and regional and in the South. It's a changing world, demographically, socially, economically, etc. And the South is a part of something bigger. The South within the U.S., as powerful as a theme as immigration, we've covered that is in the history of the U.S., it's the South. And what terms like Nuevo South speak to that. Although Nuevo South is old now. It isn't new. It's actually even a quarter of a century old now. About right around the turn of the century, late 90s. I have heard Nuevo South. I have heard it once or twice. But then also Global South is also out there too. So where you sit on that fence, where you sit on that spectrum, that I leave to you. But the world is changing. This country is changing. The South is changing. And yeah, change isn't always well received. But a part of that change, technological, economic, cultural, demographic, you and your children and you and subsequent generations are not going to be challenge free from all these changes. And I would hope that you respond as humanitarian in as humanitarian and Christian a manner as possible. But that choice is yours and not mine.
Dr. Rosales, incredibly humbled to be able to share a table with you. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for this conversation that you've been a truth teller. And I think we need that in our world. Our community is better because of your voice in it. And so I'm thankful, to be able to sit here and to try to understand in a new way, what does it look like to build an inclusive community where everyone belongs? And I think the challenges are ahead, but I just absolutely appreciate your voice in this as a guide. And that wisdom is something that I need, and I think our community needs to continue to find that pathway forward. So thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Mike. Thank you, Gyrene Mike, Devil Dog. Go Navy, baby. Go Navy.
I didn't make any Marine sailor jokes at all, so.
Go Navy.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Rosales. Appreciate you.
Of course. Thank you.
Well, a deep thank you to Dr. Rosales for guiding us through the layered history of Latino immigration to the United States and into Arkansas. His insight helped us see how migration is never just about movement. It's about labor and law and the shifting definitions of who is welcome, who is used, and who is excluded. We heard about the cycles of U.S. policy from the Bracero Program to immigration crackdowns to employer loopholes, and how these systems have defined Latino migrants as essential and as expendable, often in the same breath. We explored how Arkansas, and particularly Northwest Arkansas, became a destination for Latino immigration, drawn by the poultry plants, construction jobs, and the promise of opportunity, even as community support, housing, and protection lagged far behind. Dr. Rosales reminded us that none of this happens in a vacuum. Migration follows the path of economic demand, and that path has been shaped by powerful institutions whose needs have often set the terms for who gets to belong. And that's where we're going to go next. Because in our next episode, we're going to sit down with Olivia Pascal, a PhD candidate in history at the University of Virginia. She's writing her dissertation on the rise of Walmart and Tyson's at J.B. Hunt in the Arkansas Ozarks.
The questions that are really interesting are, where do the Ozarks sit in this system of globalized capitalism, global labor and supply chains? What can we learn from other places where similar dynamics are at play, and how are people doing things differently? And I do think the question of capitalism, good or bad, is actually a really good starting point for looking at these other questions, because if you are not willing to question the system, then maybe you aren't seeing the other alternatives. Northwest Arkansas alone is not going to make or break the capitalist system, but we do happen to have two major players in it in our own backyards.
With Olivia, we step into the story of corporate power, how these companies came to define the economy, culture, and civic life of Northwest Arkansas, and how their influence today continues to shape everything from immigration to housing to political discourse. Because if we want to understand the story of belonging, we can't just follow the people, we have to follow the power. I want to say thank you for listening, and thank you for being the most important part of what our community is becoming. This is The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place.